Um, this is the Zen of Trauma Part 3. I already videoed one segment of this and was interrupted by a phone call, so try again. In order to have social intercourse, if you will, there are three assumptions that must be present, I think. First, the world is relatively safe, the world is relatively fair, and the world is relatively predictable. These three assumptions that we hold, I think most people tend to hold, make it possible for us to form relationships, to go to work, to plan for the future, and so forth. The problem for trauma survivors is that when trauma strikes, the world is no longer safe, fair, or predictable. We don't go to work expecting that we'll be raped somewhere in the building, or that perhaps a part of the building will fall down and crush some people that we're close to, or even if we're not close to. When we witness human suffering on that scale, it burns itself into our memory. The world is no longer safe. It's certainly no longer predictable, and it's not fair. It's not fair that I survived and others did not in combat, or so I feel. When this happens and the world is no longer fair, safe, or predictable, certain things happen. How do we live our life? For one thing, I think many veterans especially feel like they have to sit with their back to the wall so they know where the entrances and exits are, that they can see their fields of fire, if you will. And if they don't, they develop a certain sense of anxiety that makes it very difficult to have any kind of communication at the dinner table. We sometimes change our behavior in other ways, like, for example, we might not go out at night, or we may not go out of the house at all. We may feel a heightened sense of anxiety, what you might call hypervigilance, and have exaggerated startle responses. So when some of us hear a certain kind of helicopter fly overhead, we're triggered, our memory is triggered, and we develop a sense of heightened anxiety. I know for myself, it's difficult for me to be around fireworks on the 4th of July. Those things, especially because they happen at night, and my trauma happened at night, I'm sent right back to the jungle in Vietnam, and I suffer as a result. So it's hard for me to celebrate those particular holidays. Yeah, so the world for a trauma survivor is not fair, it's not safe, and it's not predictable. And as a result, we have those behavior responses I was talking about. The question is, I think, how do we deal with that? Some people don't deal with it, they cope with it. They cope with alcohol or with drugs. They may engage in multiple sexual relationships. They may have a very hard time with intimacy at all. For them, the world is a very different place than those around them. And that in itself creates problems. Sometimes the language is different. If my partner were to use the phrase rock and roll or something like that, for me it means a somewhat different thing than the musical version of that phrase. Well, what can I say? I think over time, what can help is to repetitively tell the story, to become intimate with it, if you will, to bring it into us, to own it, to make it ours. When we can do that, we can change our relationship to it. Instead of it being the the horse that drags the cart around. We become the driver of the horse and are able to steer that horse. My therapist one time told me, Harvey, you think that the world is a dangerous place. And I said, yeah, you're right, I have evidence of that. And he said, well, why don't you think about it as the world is a place with danger in it? That slight change in language and the way we phrase it makes some difference in it. If the world is a place with danger in it as opposed to a dangerous place, I can find ways to cope with that or deal with that in different ways that are perhaps more healthy. The question of coping and dealing, I think, is an important one. Coping gets us through the night. It's like putting some kind of numbing agent on a tooth when we have a toothache. We get us through the night, but in the morning we still are faced with a painful tooth. So what we have to do is go to the dentist and sit in the chair and allow the dentist to do what the dentist does, and we work it through. Similarly, I think in the case of trauma survivors, one of the things we need to do is work through that trauma somehow. And that's hard because the working through process is a process of touching that thing that hurts us the most, that we're afraid of the most. I used to have patients that would spend all of their energy basically keeping their traumatic event in a closet and keeping that door closed, and they would push hard against that door so that it wouldn't open and they wouldn't have to re-experience the trauma. And then the problem is, as long as they're doing that, they're not effectively dealing with it. They're basically coping, and that just maintains the trauma basically, and sometimes it even makes it worse. What I would often say to them is, let's, after a certain period of time and we've developed a deeper relationship, I might say to them, let's open that door and see how big and bad and ugly it is. Because the reality is you've already experienced it. It's already yours. It can't hurt you again in the same way, for sure. So when we open the door and we let it out and we're able to address it, something good happens as a result, I think. We begin to own it. We begin to be comfortable with it, more comfortable with it, if you will. And its power in our lives is lessened. That's, I guess, my teaching, if you will, for the day. I can see the wind is starting to pick up, and I may have to put this umbrella down and deal with the sun in southern New Mexico. In any event, you have a good day, I hope, and leave your comments, if you will. And if you need to talk to me or would like to talk to me about whatever, give me a call. My number is 575-680-6680. My email address is harveyhilbert@yahoo.com. I'd be happy to engage in a conversation with you, and maybe we can work together. Thank you again, and take good care of yourselves. Be well.